Welcome to the 6th episode of The Protective Factor, conversations that inspire hope and healing. My name is Zaki, one of the licensed clinicians at New Jersey Statewide Student Support Services of Morris-Sussex. We are generously funded by the Department of Children and Families. Be sure to like and follow us on social media. That is NJ4S Morris-Sussex. And you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Protective Factor. My name is Zaki, and I am one of the clinicians for NJ4S. I'm here with Chris Liparini from Good Grief. Thanks for being here with us today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
For some of our listeners who don't know what Good Grief is, could you please describe what your role is, a little bit about the agency, and how one would receive services from Good Grief?
Sure. So Good Grief has 2 locations in New Jersey as well as an online presence, but we have locations in Morristown and Princeton. And at each location, families can receive a number of different services. So it's really grown since it started out in a church basement, and it was a closet where supplies would come out and there would be nights of support for families. It has now turned into multiple nights of support across both centers. And those nights of support are opportunities for families who have experienced the loss of a caregiver, a parent, a sibling, or a child to come together and get support from their peers. So it's really based on that model of getting help and support from those who've been through it. So our job at Good Grief is really to provide, we call it like the crust around that. So we really create the structure for families and kids to come together and get support from one another. So we have nights of support, which is really the cornerstone of the services, where families can come every other week. They meet and they engage in activities as well as opportunities to talk about different topics related to their grief journeys. As part of that, we have kids coming anywhere from preschool ages all the way up to caregivers. It can be parents, aunts, uncles. We know that families take many different forms. So grandparents are often caregivers as well. So families can come. Meets during the school year. So we have families coming from September all the way through June every other week to make things easier for families to come from, we know, busy lives. Pizza starts the night off. So families come, they get to eat, they get to have that informal time with one another before they go into groups according to age or family roles. In addition to that, Good Grief has really grown to have a lot of educational programming, which is how I got to know you in the first place, working with the Mental Health Association and NJ4S. So Good Grief provides workshops and ongoing trainings to schools, professional organizations. I've been all sorts of different places, so it kind of keeps growing. Thankfully, with NJ4S, our reach is really expanding as well throughout schools and different districts, providing training around clinical issues for clinicians like yourself, for teachers, school staff in many different capacities. So really providing training around what we call like basic, the 101s of grief, of what does grief look like, how can we support people who are grieving, all the way to clinical implications. So providing a lot of trainings, advocacy, so things like the grief bill in New Jersey, so really advocating to make sure that grief education is part of our kids' education. Good Grief was really, integral to that legislation being passed, so advocacy is another role. As far as what I do there, I've done a few different things. So I started at Good Grief about 3 years ago, and I was a psychologist, and I really felt the organization was doing great work, and I volunteered and I said, can I help with programming and get involved with the outreach piece? And I went to their 3 or 4 day training for all facilitators just to get a better sense of the organization. And while I was there, I kind of got hooked into facilitating. So I spent a year facilitating a teen group, and it was the best thing I could do to really have a better understanding of what Good Grief does, of really understanding that piece that we are the crust rather than, fixing anything, and really understanding you don't fix grief, but really the power that came from like those teens getting to talk with one another with other kids, not kids, but teens who get it, which is so different than what they experienced in school, and really opening my eyes up to the challenges they have that I didn't even think of things like, regrief, which is something we might talk about later, or, 10 years out from their loss, coming back to good grief, or being bullied in school because they've had a sibling or a parent die, which to me was just not even on my radar as something that could happen. So having that experience really primed me the next year when I did move into the education piece and helping with outreach of really understanding more about what participants needed. So then I've spent the last 2 years really working between an employee of Good Grief and a volunteer for Good Grief, supporting their outreach and education. So I'm currently, my role would be considered a consultant of a pro bono consultant as a psychologist, using the skills that I have as a psychologist to support their outreach programming.
Oh, that's awesome. It sounds like you all do a really amazing work for the community. And it's tough stuff. And I think because it's a tough topic, it might be why this grief bill took so long to come into fruition to begin with. So why are we not personally or professionally prepared to talk about grief? Because I feel like this grief bill is probably so many years late. It should have been spoken about so long ago, but I know that in my personal circles, but also just professionally as a therapist, it's the one topic that I really struggle talking about because there's nothing you could do about it. It's this thing that we all have to deal with. It's part of the human experience, and you'd think that would make it easier to talk about, but there's nothing you could do to change it. Other problems that clients come to talk about in session, you could do something to make some change, but you can't with this. So what are your thoughts on why this isn't something that's more spoken about?
Yeah, I think you're getting at it even in your thoughts here of we like to fix things. We're a culture of results. We're results driven. We want to see things fixed, and sitting with somebody that you can't fix with a problem that can't be fixed. It's not a problem, it's a universal experience. It's really hard to sit with that because we want to fix, we want to see results. That's what we're driven to do every day. In work, in our personal lives, we like to see results, even with weight loss or whatever it might be. We want something quick, and grief isn't like that. So I think that, that's really hard for us as a society to sit with. It's really hard to think that things can happen to us too. So when we're sitting across from someone who is telling us their story of grief, sometimes pieces of that resonate with our lives, and that's really uncomfortable to think it could happen to me. That whole phenomenon of, well, it happened to them because of this, this, and this, or if only they had done that, makes us have this fallacy of we could protect ourselves from it, when the reality is grief touches all of us. And it touches us, whether it's the death of somebody or different losses that come up in our lives. It can be something like an illness. That's a loss of your health. Infertility, the loss of how you thought your family would look, and family building. There are all different losses we have, and grief shows up, and all of those are really uncomfortable for us. I think as a society, we really suck at dealing with grief. So I'm a doctoral level psychologist. So I did 2 years of a master's program, 5 years of a doctoral program. And nowhere in that training did I have a course related to grief or death, or even a class session dedicated to that. So professionally, I think we do a lot of therapists in training, early career therapists, seasoned therapists, a disservice because it really isn't a part of a lot of our training. I don't know if you can, resonate with that of how much training we get. So this past year, I'm also the director of our the counseling psychology doctoral program at St. Elizabeth University. I did a one class session for all of our students on grief. And a lot of them commented, this is the first time we'd ever learned about this. And now I know what that is. Nobody had ever talked to me about what ambiguous loss was before, and I totally have been dealing with that. So I think it was very validating for them personally, but also they felt a little more equipped professionally of being able to help clients name experiences, and also the reality of talking about death. You can't fix it, and grief is a long process that's very messy. We like to even create these models and stages of grief, but the reality is, there's a great drawing, there's this straight line of what we think grief looks like, or this kind of bell curve, but the reality is it looks like a messy ball of yarn. That's what grief is. We have unpredictable resurgences of grief, And that's hard for us too, because we like to predict things and have things be very neat, but grief doesn't work that way.
So you mentioned the different stages that are usually talked about. So that brings me to the 5 stages of grief. So whether professionally or personally, I think that a lot of people refer to that when saying, oh, they're in the denial stage, they're in anger stage. Do you think that that wouldn't be best practice then to refer to the 5 stages of grief? Or do you think there is some legitimacy to those stages?
I think there's some legitimacy or some utility to people feeling that they can identify that this is normal, that it's normal for me to be angry. It's normal for me to feel denial. I think where we get tripped up is in thinking that there's this lockstep fashion, that first I'm going to be angry and then I'm going to bargain. You know, people go through stages in different levels, revisit other stages. So I think, to me, I think it's helpful to be able to name feelings or experiences which can be part of the grief experience rather than there being a model, because I think that can lead to people feeling like they're doing it wrong, that I should be feeling a certain way by now, when the reality is we know it takes years for us to integrate our loss into our lives, including language like we should move on. The reality is we don't move on. We integrate our loss into our lives. So I think identifying feelings and validating experiences is helpful. Models are not necessarily, or at least the 5 stages of grief. But there are also newer models which I think can help us kind of visualize grief or conceptualize it in a way that's more helpful, including this dual process model, which is like we're constantly, looking back on our losses and what we've lost, but also looking ahead and like how we're going to forge meaning in our lives and figure out what our new normal looks like, what the future looks like. That's kind of a different model that I think is helpful for people too, that you don't leave it behind. You're looking back and then looking forward as well. So models are helpful sometimes, but I think when we get too locked into them and look to them as their, this is how it must be, that people can feel like they're doing it wrong, which is problematic.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I know with my work with kids, you had mentioned this big ball of yarn, and I do this ball of grief activity where it's this tangled ball with different words on it, and the kids have to color in what they're feeling specific to their grief, which I found to be a great activity. And, that brings me to my next question. So what advice do you have for caregivers when they need to have discussions with their children, whether it's younger children versus adolescents? I just recently was watching a TV show, and there was this mother, she had a young daughter who had this goldfish that, because the girl's father had passed away, she didn't want her daughter to feel any more losses. So every time the fish died, she would remove the fish, put a new one in. So this girl thought that she had this magical fish that was just alive for 6 years, when your average goldfish doesn't last that long. So do you feel like with developmental stages, some advice for younger versus middle-aged kids to adolescents?
So I think caregivers need to go into a conversation first feeling comfortable. So the work starts before the conversation with whether it's a preschooler or a teenager or an adolescent, of really getting comfortable yourself, because we know that if you're not comfortable saying certain words, it's not going to come across in the conversation. So even being comfortable using words like died, sometimes telling people like you might have to say it out loud. I've done trainings where we walk around and different groups say died, because we're not used to saying that, right? We want to soften it, like, they went to a better place, or we're not going to see them anymore, they're asleep. So we have to be really careful. So thinking about how comfortable are we talking about it before we even go into a conversation. So I think some self-awareness about what we're comfortable with, where we maybe have unresolved loss, is important before we go into a conversation, so that we can then be present for the child or adolescent. I think it's also really important to have a general sense of expectations about what kids can process at different ages. So the expectations obviously are really different with somebody who's 3 versus somebody who's 13. So thinking about developmentally and those younger ages might most likely are not going to understand the permanence of death. So when you talk to a 3-year-old and tell them that somebody has died, they may seem to take it really well, and the next day ask you when they're next going to see that person. So also getting really comfortable with having to have the conversation more than once. So this is not a one and done. You're going to have to revisit this, whether they need the whole conversation or have more questions. So again, that's why it's so comfortable to be, important for you to be comfortable, because there's going to be a lot of questions most likely, or having to have the conversation more than once. So our younger kids will not understand the permanence of death. May have kids who kind of, as they get a little bit older in the school ages, will kind of understand the permanence, but struggle with that a little bit still. It's also really important, Good Grief has some great resources about developmental expectations to realize that every kid is unique. So whether it's because of disability or just their cognitive abilities at a certain age, using that as, again, a guideline, but not a hard and fast rule of kids should be at a certain point at a certain age. So kids may not understand the permanence of it. As they get older, they'll have more questions about the nature of the death. They may have more of what we call like those existential questions, like why did this happen? What does this mean? What does this mean for our family? So being prepared for more like the nuanced questions about death. But absolutely, with that awareness of death is permanent will come more questions. It doesn't mean that a 3-year-old grieves any less than a 10-year-old. It's just their understanding is different. And because of that, we've typically left out younger grievers from rituals because we think they don't need it because they don't really understand it. So I would also encourage families to think about including kids as much as they are comfortable with in services, in any kind of memorials, because kids need that too. And in some cultures we do that, and in other cultures it's like the kids stay home for everything for 3-4 days. They're with other caregivers, and then all of a sudden family comes back and this person has died, and we've kind of gone about things. They haven't gotten to really experience the rituals, or even in some cases see the person's body or anything else that kind of makes it more concrete that this person has died.
Yeah, now that you mention that, I don't think I've ever gone to a funeral where I've seen children. So, that really is an eye-opening thing to think about, because children really are left out of this process. And I understand from the caregiver's perspective of wanting to protect them and thinking that they won't be able to handle it. But I think what's worse is when you are shielded, you're doing almost this disservice that hurts them longer in the long run. So yeah. Everything you're saying, it makes perfect sense. Do you think the schools are well equipped when a sudden death occurs? In your experience, do you think that the school counseling staff and the teachers have been given the skills to be able to handle that when that comes unexpectedly?
I think teachers and school staff have a lot on their plates. We all know that. And I think that this is why Good Grief is now pushing into the schools more with school-based training, as well as we do groups in schools. So the Nights of Support take a different form with school-based groups as well. I think that the training, just like you and I maybe reflect on our training, we haven't had a lot of training specific to grief. I think our teachers and mental health professionals in the school are in the same position of wanting to serve students, but not knowing exactly how or knowing their role in that process. So, for example, a teacher's role would be very different than the school counselor's role. They can collaborate, but a teacher, I've spoken with teachers who feel uncomfortable or unsure of how much should I be talking about in the classroom, how much starts to feel more like the mental health piece. So I think it's important to consult. I think that's why Good Grief and other organizations are here, so that schools can reach out, especially in the case of a sudden death, of what resources are available. There are a lot of outside community resources that are available for crisis to push into the schools and support the schools, because the school personnel themselves are affected. So if you have the death of a student, I think it's remiss to think that the teacher is not affected as well. And I think that we need, when we talk about self-care for teachers and helping them stay in the profession. Part of it is providing support to them as well.
Do you see any differences in how different, I mean, I'm sure there definitely are differences in how cultures and religions experience grief. And do you think that when you're working with youth or their caregivers during good grief, that those differences do start to come up, like in group or?
Absolutely. So even when I spent my year as one of the facilitators for the teen group, just understanding that everybody culturally experiences grief differently and have different ways of memorializing their person who died. We have Latinx culture might have the Day of the Dead and different rituals, which really are about celebrating the person who died and making them front and center during that time. And then, we were talking about kids not being involved, but in certain cultures, they are very involved. So they grow up with an understanding of death and being a part of remembering that person, which is very different. Funeral services or memorial services look very different. You may go to one which has much more of like a celebratory feel. So in, traditionally Black culture will have more of that celebration of life with a repast that is more about celebrating the person. Again, and kids can be involved. So really being open, I think, is important to whatever people bring in, including thinking about there's no one way to deal with death. And really just being open to understanding different people's beliefs about death. In Good Grief, we really try to make room for them all and learn from one another and invite them to talk about it. I think it's important even for the language we use when we talk about death culturally. So I mentioned before, sometimes we talk about things like the person went to sleep. That obviously can be really confusing to a young child, but also being okay with if somebody comes in and they talk about somebody going to a better place. Culturally, in some groups, that might be the way they talk about death. They may believe that the person who died has truly gone to a better place. So being respectful of that and open to that rather than they have to say the person died, that they're in denial if they don't use the word died. It might be culturally congruent for them to use other terms and for us to be okay with that. Using things like they transitioned, that's how they perceive it, then that's how we reflect it back to them. So not being like our way of talking about it is best and that they're in denial unless they use the word died. We need to let go of that. So this is a great place to use the same language that our kids and our teens are using, reflect that back to them, and ask about how they have experienced the person being remembered, what they've done as a family, what they've done individually. So being open to that and what works for them, because what works for their family may not work for them and vice versa.
This is all good stuff to know. And I feel like one of the hardest things when somebody does experience a loss is knowing what to say to them, because we have those cliches of they're in a better place or I'm so sorry for your loss. And then beyond that, I know myself, I get stuck of what to say. And I feel like that's where I feel so lost with the grief conversation is what do I say beyond I'm so sorry for your loss?
Mm-hmm. And then what happens is people start avoiding talking to the person who's experienced a loss because we don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to make it worse, so we stay away, which is the worst thing you can do. I think most grieving people would say, I'd rather you fumble with it and keep trying and stay with me than stay away because you don't want to offend me. You don't want to hurt my feelings. A common thing is people feel like bringing up the person who died will make that person sad. So they don't want to bring up the loss that the person's experienced. They're thinking about it all the time anyway. So it can be really nice to hear that person's name being mentioned and to know that someone else is thinking about them. So just that misconception, I think, to address that if you're bringing up the loss or the person who died, that you're upsetting the person. If you think about it, it's on their mind a lot. So talking about the person, saying, hey, I remembered something about your person. I was thinking about them the other day. I was thinking about you. It's also okay to say, I don't know what to say right now. I'm with you. I've been thinking about you. So I encourage people to fumble through it because sometimes the only way that we get more comfortable is kind of screwing it up a little bit, but staying with that person. Another thing we can do for somebody who's grieving is not to put too much on them. So a lot of time, how many people get a text saying, I'm so sorry to hear about whatever happened. What can I do for you? When you're in that headspace of just experiencing a loss, or when you're grieving, having to tell people what to do that would be helpful feels completely overwhelming, or can. So offering just to do something, saying, I'm going to bring dinner on Tuesday. What could you use? Or even better, just showing up with something or leaving it. So the person doesn't necessarily have to come out, be social, entertain you, but that you're leaving something for them. So just doing something, or starting a conversation, or saying, hey, it could be a text saying, hey, I'm thinking about you. You don't have to respond to this, but you've really been on my mind and you're in my thoughts. So taking pressure off the person who's grieving, I think, would be something I would definitely recommend. And embrace awkwardness, because there's no way to get better at it. And I hate to even use the word better, because it's not like you reach like a certain level and you're like proficient in helping, because you may feel really comfortable talking to one person who's experiencing grief, and another person it's a totally different circumstance. But I think just keeping the conversation lines open. We know that people who are grieving, initially that support system around them is strong. There's so many people. It can even be exhausting. Too many casseroles, too many offers of support, watching the kids, whatever it might be. But then we look 6 months later, or even 2 months later, and that circle has gotten a lot more diffuse, a lot fewer people in it. So one of the best things you can do is also show up for someone in the months after someone has died, and not just immediately, right after a service or something like that. So really staying around. That's another loss people experience, is when all those relationships change after someone's died.
Yeah, I could imagine what it must be like to have all that overwhelming support in the beginning, and then all of a sudden, while you're still going through it, then when you really need people maybe the most, you don't have it. Because if you're still in that shock feeling and denial in the beginning when you first have the loss, and then, then you lead into more of those feelings of depression when you really need people, that's when they're not there. So this is all really good stuff to know, because I've always had it in my mind that, maybe they don't want to talk about it anymore, or when that anniversary comes up of, let me not mention it. But like you had said, they're already thinking about it. So this will definitely change the way that I, interact with loved ones when, they lose somebody.
Yeah. Can I just add a point to that, which is when we think about kids. So we're having this conversation about how to support someone who's grieving. And in my mind, I'm thinking about, how do I talk to another adult who's experienced a death or another type of loss? But you think about kids. Kids, we think about this kid. Let's picture like somebody who's in like second grade. Picture them going back to school after they've had somebody in their family die, of a sibling or a parent, expecting kids to know how to respond to it. So we have to help other kids know how to respond to someone in their class or in their lives who's experienced a loss. So as parents and caregivers, we need to model that. So keeping in mind, it's not just if we've experienced a loss, but in our community, of helping our kids know how to talk to somebody who's experienced a death is so important. And if we struggle with it, imagine how much more difficulty a second grader is going to have reaching out to a peer and trying to support them.
See, I couldn't even imagine that. I'm trying to imagine in my mind a second grader going to a friend trying to talk about death, and it's really hard to envision. And I think that the fact that this grief bill was just passed, I think it's going to be really good. I'm really curious to see what types of conversations we have with students moving forward after they have this education this next school year. And I mean, how do we get, though, to that point? And I think that's the big question, from pain to healing. Because when someone's going through it, it first happens, it feels like this is never going to go away. And we know that eventually healing does happen, but we know that timelines shouldn't really exist, but some people have in their mind, you should feel, if you're still grieving and crying every day a year from now, then like there's something wrong. Or if it's like 5 years from now, but then we get worried about somebody if after a month they seem like they're okay and they're going about life like normal. So Could you speak to that of, why it might be different for other people and how we get from that pain to healing?
I think everybody's experience is different, so it's really important for us not to judge that person who looks like they're quote unquote moving on. We don't know what's going on internally for them, and we see them in maybe one setting. We don't know what the rest of their life looks like and how they're integrating that. Sometimes some people say, well, I just push it down and I keep moving forward. And sometimes that's the way our mind helps us do that. For some people, it's just so overwhelming to think of opening up that box that they feel like if I open up my grief box, I may never be able to close it again. Some people dip their toe into it little by little and experience it, and other people are okay with the waves coming when they come. So everybody just experiences grief differently and how they deal with it. So I think for us to not judge how it looks, or that it's been a month or it's been a year, and what that looks like. How many times do we look at somebody who's moved on in a new relationship after their partner has died, and either it's, they waited too long and they should be out there, or it's too soon. What another complicated layer for somebody who's already grieving to feel like they have to figure out the rules of when it's acceptable for them to start a new relationship. So it's really hard to know exactly when you're supposed to do anything. Like, when is it okay to move on, or when should I be healing? I like to think of it as, I love pictures, and there's another picture on social media which talks about grief isn't like it gets smaller as time goes on, but our life gets bigger around it. So picturing that, I think, can take, again, some of the pressure off of us that we should be moving on or over it. It's about keeping our life full around it and acknowledging it's still there. So people don't get over the person who has died. Families who go on to have another child, or people who go on to have another partner, doesn't mean that they've moved on and forgotten the person. It's life gets bigger, but that loss is there and still acknowledged. Whether we see them acknowledging it or not, they don't have to prove anything to us that they still think of that person or that they're a part of their life. So I think sometimes we look for proof in some ways from people that they're still grieving. I think it's just another really heavy burden to bear, that we're supposed to move on, yet at the same time, acknowledge them. And we look for them to look a certain way.
It is a lot of pressure. I mean, it's two different sides that you need to juggle at once. And I could only imagine that it would make the grief process even harder for the person that's experiencing it. And not just death of a person. I could imagine other types of losses, a big one being pets. I feel like for a lot of kids, some of their first losses is the loss of a pet. And there seems to be judgment, I think, on people's reactions sometimes towards the loss of a pet. Sometimes people need to take off from school or work. They need those personal days. Or there's that judgment if you get a pet right away. And, it's so sad because sometimes it's like that's just what you need, in that you need to fill that hole with a new pet. Or maybe you need to not have a pet for a while. Maybe you need to grieve for about a month. And it's still a legitimate loss that I don't think is completely legitimized everywhere. I think the death of a person certainly is, but not so much as pets, which for kids, and we work with kids, that's for a lot of them their first loss.
Absolutely. So yeah, pets can be the first loss, or what you might see is a huge reaction to a pet, like even the goldfish, and wonder why this child is having this huge reaction to a goldfish they had for 2 weeks. And sometimes that loss brings up previous losses. So then they're having this big reaction. But I think also we minimize the bond we have with pets. In the grief community, we talk about disenfranchised grief, and pet loss definitely falls under that. Like, it was just a pet. Why are they so upset? When the reality is that bond. I mean, pets are great because it's unconditional love. They don't really ask the same things of you, and they're just so present and empathic in a way a lot of humans aren't. That loss is huge. And sometimes we get another pet because we miss having a pet, and it's not the same pet, but it's a great experience to practice our approach to grief when a child or a teen has experienced the loss of a pet. That's a great opportunity to talk about it and practice having these conversations and validating their feelings, including if they don't want another pet. right away, and not enough time has passed. And how are we going to remember that pet? What do you want to do? Do you want to have some special tradition we have, or talking about the memories of that pet across time? All those are really important ways to help them kind of, again, dip their toe in grief, but not to minimize that. That itself is a loss. Absolutely.
And you had mentioned regrief before, and that makes me think of, you had mentioned the child that had the goldfish for 2 weeks, why that would be hard for them. But if they have experienced other losses, like they lost a parent or a grandparent, this fish could signify so much more. But I'm also thinking as they get older and the certain milestones that, their loved one might not be there for, whether it's graduation, prom, going to college, their first job. Could you speak a little to what you see at Good Grief when it comes to regrief and maybe people who come in and out of your agency?
Sure. So our members that come to Good Grief, our families, sometimes come immediately after a loss, a death. So they might be there 2 months after somebody has died. But you might see them stay for a year and then leave. And then the door is always open at Good Grief. So families can come back. And you see that a lot where families come back. It could be 10 years after the person has died, that regrief experience where now they've had their first, they got their license, and they always pictured their dad being there for that and giving them driving lessons, or they had a prom and they always pictured their mom being there and helping them get ready. So the regrief can come up with those different milestones because it's missing that person in a different way, missing the role they would have had. They're not there for that. And also, your grief changes as you get older because you understand it in a different way. So that 3-year-old now is understanding it as a 13-year-old and the finality of that and what it really means not to have that person there at different points in their life.
So at Good Grief, with the different groups that you have, could you talk a little bit about who runs them? Are they peer-led? Are these people that are licensed clinicians? And what exactly are they teaching or doing in these groups?
So these are not therapy groups. Good Grief makes it very clear that these groups are peer support. So they are not peer-led, though. We have a great group of volunteers at Good Grief. About twice a year or more, we do volunteer training, which is about 4 days. So our volunteers are 30 to 40 hours trained about grief and how to facilitate a group. They also go through yearly refreshers with different topics at a peer institute. So they get a lot of training to get comfortable, first of all, with their own grief and become very self-aware so it doesn't bleed into the group. But then how to run a group, how to support the group members is really important. So you have these facilitators who are volunteers, and each night has a different topic and some questions or activities. So there's some basic structure to it. But outside of that, it's really a chance for the group members to seek and give support from one another. But the groups have rules. So you only give advice if somebody asks for it. So nobody is dominating the group, telling everyone else like they're farther along of what should be done, how you should deal with it. But really, it's an opportunity every couple of weeks for people to get together and talk about what they're experiencing and ask other group members if they've been there. So we know from group therapy and group dynamics that it's just something really powerful about being able to share something with someone else who understands it. The participants, whether it's the adults or the kids, talking about this is a place where people understand what I'm going through. So our job as facilitators is really to connect the group participants with one another to give that peer support. It is not therapy. If people want referrals to therapy, Good Grief is equipped with referrals that they can give them for individual family therapy, anything they might need, like as an adjunct to coming to Good Grief.
Are there any commonalities or like concerns that you see where caregivers come in, maybe behaviors that they see with the youth that, is also dealing with the loss, like behavior changes or struggles that they may have had and trying to have these conversations?
So when we think about that developmental piece of kids who are grieving, it can look a lot of different ways. So caregivers may talk about, kids becoming more clingy, or on the other side really withdrawing and they're in their room a lot. So it could go either way. You can just see a lot of different changes. So caregivers will come in talking about, I've never seen this from them before. Like they want to sleep in my bed again. We haven't done that for years. Or they really just don't want to talk. They've shut down. They used to talk a lot. So you might see disruptive behavior in school, changes in concentration, grades at school. So just changes in behavior, but Good Grief will help families recognize that these changes are unfortunately just part of kids working through grief. It's not that something that they've done wrong as far as parents, but also supporting caregivers and thinking about ways that they can help their kids. So things like consistent routine, structure, keeping boundaries, discipline, being still on the table, like not letting everything off the table because they've experienced grief, of give them a break. Kids need structure, especially after they've experienced loss. So creating opportunities for caregivers to take care of themselves, because we know one of the best predictors for the kids' outcomes are the parents or caregivers' outcomes. So if we have healthy caregivers working through their own grief, they're going to be more available to kids.
And would you say that with some of those clingier behaviors, if your child wants to start sleeping with you in the bed, or you have that child that's like withdrawn and maybe wants to start eating dinner in their room, I know you mentioned that the routine is important, but is there some leeway for if your child wants to spend some nights in the bedroom? Should you let them, or should it really be like, no, like you should be sleeping in your room because you have your own room and your own bed?
I think that's kind of dependent on each situation, and a lot of that is like based on what the caregiver is going to be comfortable with too. It's important. There's going to be a new normal. It's never going to be the way it was just because they had their own room. Their needs may be different now, and recognizing over time those needs change. So just because a child wants to come back and sleep with you right now, that may be what they need. And regression is very normal, but it doesn't mean they're going to be in bed with you forever. But a lot of families will talk about, oh, they're still sleeping with you. That's a very common thing for kids to rejoin parents or caregivers wanting to be closer, keeping in mind that they may be afraid that something's going to happen to their remaining parent or caregiver. So some of that can come from the anxiety of, are you going to be okay?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I mean, depending on the age, it probably would be appropriate. What would you say would be a good thing based on age for elementary versus middle school versus high school for a caregiver to say to a youth about a person who passed away?
Of how to start a conversation?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to make sure that it's a conversation that's intentional, no matter what their age is. You don't want this to be something that's going to be interrupted, or you only have a few minutes for between, coming home from school and practice. You want to make sure that you have a dedicated space and time to have this conversation with them. And again, we talked about some of the prep work, making sure you're comfortable with language and you're comfortable, you feel prepared to talk about the death or loss that you want to share. I think using language that's appropriate is important. So if we're talking to a 3-year-old, it might be explaining that so-and-so's body stopped working. Because again, we want to avoid those kind of euphemisms like they went to sleep, like understanding like their body was really sick and it stopped working, or can use terms like they were in a lot of pain and they were really sick, and now their body has stopped working. Again, part of the next piece of the conversation is going to be dependent on your belief system. So it's almost like we want to start out by explaining what happened to the person. The body stopped working, or they were very sick for a long period of time. Sometimes it's the pre-conversation. So if you know someone has a terminal illness and it's long-term, the first conversation should probably be happening earlier, preparing the younger person for their death. They're very sick, and that we expect that they are going to die at some point, that they're not going to be able to fix this. So it can help to have pre-conversations if you know that a death is coming in the future. Unfortunately, we don't always know that. So in the cases of a sudden death or unexpected death, we wouldn't have that piece of the conversation, but explaining that the body has stopped working for our younger kids. As they get older, they get that piece. So, not dancing around it so much. Eventually we need to say that the person has died. It's like ripping off the Band-Aid. It's hard for us. It's hard to see that child hear it, but it has to happen. So just also silence as part of the conversation. Like after you've explained that the person has died, giving them a moment to absorb that and not rushing to fill it with words. And then you might want to give some details, as much as is appropriate for their age. So around the circumstances of their death, anything you know about that you think would be helpful. For younger kids, you don't want to give every single detail about maybe if there was a car accident or something else. And then I think a good tail end of a conversation, after you've explained that, maybe talked about your beliefs, like where that person has gone or what's going to happen next, is really important. So helping them understand, we're going to have a service, people are going to gather, this is what it's going to look like, can be really helpful. Like, what happens now? If it's a caregiver, letting them know who is going to be there to help take care of them. That's really important. So them knowing you are going to be cared for, certain things will not change for you. This is what your life will look like the next few days and then beyond. And then after you talk about what's going to happen next, asking them if they have questions, whether it's a 3-year-old or 13-year-old, they're going to have questions. Your 3-year-old questions are going to probably be a little all over the place. So being ready for that. They might have a lot of questions, including ones that are a little uncomfortable for us, like what happens to their body, who gets things, like just actually a mortician or a funeral director has written a book with a lot of these questions kids ask, and they are all over the place. So just being prepared for that. You want to ask if people have any questions, because you don't want them to fill in the gaps with misinformation, whether it's from social media or just their imagination. Especially with our younger kids, they're going to fill in gaps with their imagination, and it's obviously not going to be really accurate. So the first part is making sure you have a dedicated time and space to talk about this, letting them know that the person has died, if you, as much or as little detail as you want, and then really you can talk about your beliefs, what's going to happen next, and then making sure there's time for questions.
And do you find that the older the kid gets, the easier the conversation is, or does it get harder because of the more they understand?
It's just different. It's just like raising kids, right? Like sometimes people talk about, oh, this is the easier stage. As somebody who has 2 kids and has had to have conversations about death, none of them are easy. It's just different. So what might seem very cut and dry with a 3-year-old, because they're like, okay, and they go about their business, they're the one calling you into their room at night saying, tell me what happened again. And you're doing it every night for like 3 months. So it's exhausting in that way, versus when you have a 13-year-old who wants to talk to you about like the implications of this and what this means and where did they really go and how do we know this? So it's just different. And then being prepared that this is just one of many conversations you're probably going to have. One of my colleagues at Good Grief, who did a lot of work in palliative care with kids, talked about like just getting ready. You're going to have this conversation over and over and over again. It's like when they want you to tell the same story, they need to know that they can ask you again and again, and that you're available for that.
And do the groups, do they get organized at Good Grief based on the type of loss? Like, would somebody who had a loss due to an illness or an accident be in a different group than maybe somebody who lost someone due to suicide?
No. So groups, especially for the kids, our kids and teens are grouped just by age. So developmental level, each has its own color, we use colors assigned to them for those groups. Although in the case of child loss, the caregivers have a separate group for that unique loss.
And do you have any resources that you could share with the audience about for the different age groups, whether it's books or podcasts or other resources that you're aware of?
Sure. So of course, Good Grief. I have to plug Good Grief has a lot of really good resources on their website, including like these really great fact sheets. So I know when you're grieving, everything is even mentally exhausting. So we give you like the cheat sheet of the facts or tips on how to do certain things or the highlights. So check out Good Grief. We have a lot of great resources, including some videos about some of the topics we've talked about today. Some of my other favorites are What's Your Grief? They have a lot of great sheets and kind of videos, and I think some podcasts as well. Modern Loss also has some really great resources. I would also recommend you to consider going to your library and also looking at books that you can use with kids. One of the things I really love to do is bibliotherapy, which the basic, the the layman's terms for that is using books to help people. So looking at picture books or other books that can be helpful to use with kids that helps them see another character going through something similar to them can be a great way to have those ongoing conversations about death. We talked about pet loss. There's a great book, I think it's called The 10 Good Things About Barney. It's like a classic in grief literature for pet loss, which is after their dog Barney dies, of reflecting on all the good things about him. So that can be a really great way, whether it's a pet loss or a death of a person in their life, to start that conversation or keep that conversation going.
Thank you so much for sharing all the resources and for meeting with us today. I mean, this was a lot of great information. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our listeners have definitely learned a lot too. I really appreciate you being here.
I'm glad I could come.